I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and this is of course the new BMW M4. The BMW M4 is an important car for this Bavarian manufacturer. Why? Because it carries on a very long-running spirit of two-door performance cars from this brand. The artist formerly known as the M3 morphed into the M4 in the previous generation for the two-door coupe and the convertible version of this car, though you can still get a four-door M3, and there's even an M3 wagon coming. I've reviewed the sedan on the channel already, but today we're going to be talking about arguably the purist's choice of this set of BMW M cars, the M4 Coupe, which I've brought along with me today in this rather resplendent, almost Jaffa shade of orange or red. And I mean, color aside, there's no missing the M4 in virtually any color. Perhaps the black, hides that front end a little bit, but really from almost any other angle, the M4 is a pretty conventional looking vehicle. Arguably a little bit anonymous and not particularly BMW-esque from the rear or the rear three-quarter, but handsome enough. And then you get to the nose. And I think before we persist with this review, we'll go through all of our normal stuff, we'll jump inside, we'll discuss running costs, and then we'll go out onto the road. I think we need to have a bit of a group therapy session about the schnoz. So why did they do it? I mean, the M4 isn't the first car from BMW to debut this new look. The standard 4 Series ushered it in probably 18 months, 2 years ago now, so we've had quite a while to process this. But I think its most aggressive interpretation is on the M3 and M4 as we see it here. Unadorned by chrome, I think it works a little bit better for this car, but it's been an interesting psychological process. When we first saw the schnoz, everybody was appalled, basically. And then you start to have the contrarians come through who say, no, it's great, I love it. And of course, you can tell me down below what you think. Personally, I've kind of gone through the stages of grief with this nose. I am a 3 Series owner, so this is confronting to me. But I've come out the other side of those stages of grief, still hating it. Yeah, I think it's a mistake. I think that it's lost the handsome proportions at the front end of virtually every generation of 3 Series has been known for, and I hope they reverse their decision. But design is subjective. That's a very subjective opinion. You can let me know if you agree down below. Next up, let's jump inside, far more conventional in there. Inside, the M4 Competition certainly isn't as showy when it comes to aesthetics as the Mercedes-AMG C63. Instead, it's really straight down to business in here, but BMW are at the top of their game in terms of interior quality. The way the materials are screwed together, the choice of materials used, it's all absolutely top class, and this vehicle feels incredibly well made. Now, the layout itself is functional and Teutonic, but everything is where you would expect to find it. The iDrive system continues to be the best in the business with the choice of a rotary dial or a touchscreen, plus there's wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto and an excellent Harman Kardon stereo. Now, if it was my car, I'd probably just leave it there and choose one of the available attractive color combinations, but you can up the ante on the sporting factor by choosing carbon fiber trim. This car has the extended carbon package, which includes a pair of actually relatively uncomfortable carbon buckets up front with a hard piece of carbon right between your legs, which for some drivers will be found to be relatively uncomfortable and poorly positioned. So I just stick with the regular pews, which have plenty of adjustment and plenty of support for dynamic driving in the first place. Now, there are back seats. They're relatively roomy actually because of this car's two-door sedan shape, but of course those that are needing extra practicality will probably prefer the M3 sedan. Here around the back of the BMW M4, there's a lot less to be outraged about because it's perfectly handsome, if not particularly familiar to people that might already own a BMW 4 Series or a previous two-door 3 Series. I mean, there's a few notes of Infiniti Q60, I would say, in this car, but otherwise it's probably just a new design trope from BMW that we'll have to get used to. Either way, I don't find it offensive, I think it's fine. Now, being the M4, we've got a very aggressive diffuser down here with quad pipes. There's absolutely no doubting what kind of car this is. And the other thing is that the M4 does have a widened stance compared to the standard 4 Series coupe. So it continues to look pretty bulgy when you're sitting behind this car in traffic. Now, obviously we need a power tailgate. So that opens up and reveals a decent amount of space in this boot. The M4 is still a two-door sedan. That's what it would have been referred to in the olden days. And so it's significantly more practical than some other sports cars of the same ilk. You can see we had no trouble getting all 3 of the Chasing Cars suitcases in here, which is great. In terms of special cubbies, we've got some netted areas off to the left and right of the boot. You won't find a spare underneath that boot floor, however. Then we have our controls here to lower the boot or to lower it and lock the car. Last step before we take this 375 kilowatt bruiser out onto the road is to talk about what this is going to cost you to run. Running a performance car like the BMW M4 isn't really supposed to be cheap. One way that you can minimize your costs is by purchasing an upfront service plan for the car. BMW sell 5-year, 80,000 kilometer transferable packs. Now, the pricing for the M4 isn't actually published, but we know that there's generally a discount of sort of $1,000 to $2,000 compared to paying for it every time you bring the car in for a service. Now, those intervals have been condition based on BMWs for a very long time. They're generally sort of annual 10 to 15,000 kilometers, but it will depend on your driving style in this car. The warranty for the M4, like other BMWs, is only 3 years, and it's worth keeping in mind that the AMG C63 coupe has a 5-year unlimited kilometer warranty, so when you're negotiating on the car, make sure to bring that up and see if BMW will throw in an extended warranty to get your business. Fuel consumption, again, is something that's going to depend on driving style. The new motor in the M4 is actually relatively efficient on the highway. It'll return around 8 litres per 100 Ks quite easily, but backroad blasting, you're going to see consumption of around 15 litres per 100. Well, it's great to get behind the wheel of the new BMW M4 on the road. I have driven this car on the track down at Phillip Island ages ago, like 6 months ago, but because of various COVID related reasons, it's taken a long time for us to get a road test of this car. But that's happening right now. And there's so much to talk about because while this car polarizes in terms of its exterior design, it's really designed to get the M4 back on track as a great road car, pardon the track reference and pun. Because the previous generation M4 was never that friendly to drive on road, at least here in Australia, where there's a lot of bumps on our B roads, and the rear suspension was just so stiff that it was off the ground a lot of the time and causing all sorts of stability control intervention too much of the time. And while the M3 and M4 aren't tuned here in Australia, it turns out that the changes that have been made to the new generation make them much more likable on our local roads. But I'll come to the ride and handling in just a second. First of all, let's talk about the engine. It's the new BMW S58 motor. We saw it last year in the X3 and X4 M competition. It's now here in the M3 and M4. Now, we only get the competition spec in Australia, and that means the full fat 375 kilowatt outputs, 650 Newton meters of torque, which is very, very strong indeed from this twin turbocharged 3-litre inline 6-cylinder unit. And the good news is that when I drove it in the X3M last year, there was a big problem. It was doughy. It took way too long for torque to arrive at low RPM, so it felt doughy. It felt a bit slow off the line actually, and then you got a huge whack of torque arriving at sort of 3,000 to 4,000 RPM. For the new M3 and M4, it's clearly been retuned because there is much better throttle response at low RPM, so it makes it feel really responsive when you see a gap in traffic or when you're just punching it off the lights or whatnot and you want that sort of immediacy from this motor, which is great. It's actually a terrific motor, feels incredibly strong pretty much everywhere, but it does like to rev as well, as we found on track. Now, power is the same as an Alfa Romeo Giulia Quadrifoglio, but torque is way higher, and so you never really find yourself wanting the 4-litre V8 in a C63 or something like that. This is entirely enough go and enough shove in the M4. Now this particular car I've got is a rear wheel drive version with the 8-speed ZF torque converter auto, and one thing BMW have managed to do is comprehensively fix the crap low speed drivability of the old M4 by changing from the MDCT dual clutch gearbox to a ZF torque converter, which is now fast enough, snappy enough to do service in this full fat M car. And that's great. It creeps normally, it reverses normally, then out here, you know, it snaps off really, you know, quick shifts off the paddles, and the paddles themselves have a really nice textured back to them so they don't just feel like cheap plastic, which in a car like this I think is important. That being said, I'd personally still go for the manual because you still can, and you can't in an RS4 or 5 or a C63, so why not take up BMW on that opportunity while it's still being offered to us, eh? Looking forward to driving the manual M3 and or M4 soon. Haven't done so yet, but the good thing is that they're still really well equipped with a manual. You still get lots of toys, not quite as many toys as with the auto, but you know, still very good. And then also later on, there's an all drive version coming too, which is auto only. Now, the real difference between something like this M4 and an M440i comes down to the suspension and steering, which is totally bespoke for the M4. We've got basically a whole bunch of extra rigidity. This is the highest torsional rigidity ever seen on a two-door M3 or M4. Heaps of extra bracing in the engine bay and out the back, some of which you can see, some you can't. There's comprehensively redesigned strut towers, particularly at the front, extensive use of aluminium throughout the suspension to save weight. The 5-link independent rear suspension out the back has had comprehensive changes from the previous generation M4. We are on a different platform here, the cluster architecture platform, but the rear suspension is actually more docile than it was in the past. While overall rigidity is up, there's better compliance from the rear end on road, and as such, there's a much better ability to put the torque down in this generation compared to the last car. The M4 CS wasn't as bad in the last shape on our roads, but thankfully out of the box, the new M4 is a significant improvement, as is the steering, which is the new version of the M Servotronic electric power steering rack. It has variable ratio, it has speed sensitive power steering ratio through it. But what matters most is that it just has more feel than the old steering rack. It still kind of pales in comparison to an E46 like my car, but compared to the previous M4, it's veritably fizzing, which is great. You do get a sense of road imperfections that the front wheels are traversing. The ratio in it feels really intuitive at normal road speeds. The steering wheel itself is probably a little big, and all the carbon, you know, you can probably hold that. It's not really to my taste, but the point is that what's running through the steering rack is better this time around. We all know they have to use electric power steering racks pretty much. You know, this isn't a Porsche GT car, but this is a good example of improvement. It's still probably not my favorite electric power steering rack, but it's definitely you know, more driver engagement being afforded this time around, which is terrific. The brakes as well have two settings, a comfort setting and a sport setting. Comfort does feel a bit soft, a bit doughy underfoot, but sport feels really good actually. Nice bite when you get into the pedal. Pop off a couple of downshifts. Little tweak of the rear end on exit, because we now have a 10-stage traction control system. BMW M kind of chasing after AMG in that regard, but it works really well. You can steer the car on the throttle, keep it balanced in the corners. Just turn it in nicely. It's quick. It is quick, there's no doubting that. Nice view out over the prow as well. Good visibility generally. Yeah. And then we've got all this BMW assisted driving stuff that works really well. Lane keep assist is calibrated properly in this car. Adaptive cruise is good. We've got AEB, we've got blind spot. it's all there. And refinement's pretty decent too when you just want to cruise. It's not too loud. It's not as supple or as comfortable as a Giulia Quadrifoglio or an RS5, but it is more livable daily than a C63. And I think there's really something here for fast BMW aficionados. If you can get past that grille, I would totally excuse you if you can't. But I guess the best thing about being inside the car, a bit like being whoever said it about being in the Jules Verne restaurant in the Eiffel Tower, is that this is the only place you can't see the grille, pretty much. So this is where you want to be, because when you're here, you're happy. So those are my opinions on the 2021 BMW M4 Competition. To be honest, this is a really good driver's car. It's an improvement on the old M4 because it rides better and even changes to things like the new torque converter gearbox, which is fast enough to keep up with the old dual clutch but doesn't have those low speed foibles, all helps make the M4 really practical every day. My personal choice would still be to go for an M3 in sedan or the upcoming touring version. That being said though, with the front of these cars being such an affront, you have to wonder how many people will choose an M340i instead that might have made the leap to the M3 or the M4 in the past. But maybe I'm overblowing it. You can tell me how you're processing the whole change down there in the comments. While you're there, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.